Welcome to the TufFish Show. I am so excited to bring to you Dr. Michelle Mazur. Dr. Michelle, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me, Jen. I am excited to talk about writing books.
I am so glad you said yes, because this is going to be such a fun conversation. And I would love for you to start with, how did you get into writing?
Wow.
You're welcome.
I feel like I've been writing forever. I mean, honestly, I have a PhD in communication. So you have to write a lot of papers and you have to write a dissertation. And really, the first book I ever wrote was a dissertation, well, probably a master thesis, then a dissertation. So, I mean, it's always just been a part of my professional life and what I was doing. And it's funny because I've written 3 books now, and anytime I get a new idea, I tell my husband, I'm like, I think it needs to be a book. He's like, of course it needs to be a book. You're an author. You write. That is one of the things you do. I'm like, oh, yeah, it makes sense.
I love that too. I mean, so did the writing start even as a young person in the sense of journaling, or were you always, favoring a paper over a test kind of thing?
No, I think I always like to talk things out. So I'd much rather take a test than have to craft, especially back in the day we had typewriters. We did not
Fair
have
enough.
handy dandy computers, and it was a pain in the butt to write a paper. But I wasn't like a big journaler or any of that. And then it was really when I decided to go into academia. I was just like, oh, well, this is all about writing, so I'm going to be writing. That's fine. And it was never like I didn't like it or felt hesitant. It was just, okay, whatever.
I love that. I love that so much. So then to your point where an idea hits you and your hubby says that, and you go, I think that's a book. And he's like, of course. Then how did the first book come about?
So the first book I wrote was called Speak Up for Your Business. And I kind of take the same approach because as a business owner, I have realized, especially in online business, that all you do is write, 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 write. Like you write emails, you write blog posts, you write podcast scripts, social media posts. All you're doing is writing all the time,
Uh-huh.
which is a dirty little secret about owning a business, but it is true. So, with the first book, I had a ton of content already on public speaking. So, for me, it was really about taking that content, getting it into like a Google Doc, and then starting to like figure out like, okay, so what's the flow of this book? What's the argument I need to make? And really looking at like what were the blog posts I had, what was missing, how does this need to be all organized, and then starting to go in and then really shape the raw material into chapters that are building a cohesive argument, so it's just not like this random book of blog posts that I'm putting together. But that was really the process. It was like taking everything that I had been writing and looking at it and being like, okay, there is a book in here about how you can speak up for your business. Like, what is the shape of this book, and figuring that out and figuring out what the chapters were, and then really going through and turning it into a book.
I love that. And it feels like it's also a nice precursor to the messaging of your business, the 3-word rebellion, or it's like just the
Yes.
communication rebel. Like all of those things come into play because it is about writing to have purpose, writing to elicit an action, to create something and create something bigger than yourself. I mean, just speaking up for your business is you wanting to do something bigger than yourself.
Yes. Yeah, and I feel like that is a theme in all of the work that I've done, whether it's Speak Up for Your Business or the 3-word rebellion. It's all about how do we advocate for our work? How do we get it out in the world so that it reaches the people it needs to reach and has an impact? And yeah, I feel like if that's like the thread for all of the work that I have done since starting this business, really.
I can totally see that. Absolutely. So with the three-word rebellion, which is this is the first edition of this book. And as you can see, if you're watching the YouTube video, you can see this is my copy that has all kinds of little post-its at the top, and there's dog-eared pages and highlights in here. And to some that might seem sacrilegious. Oh my goodness, you wrote in a book, you turned the pages down, there's stickies everywhere. I personally see that as an act of love to a book.
Mhm.
Michelle, what do you think?
I
Especially being the
agree.
author.
Oh, yeah. Well, and it's really funny because I started that book off, and it starts with a note and permission from me and the book. And the whole purpose of the Three Word Rebellion book is for you to use it to find your message, to find your start with why, or to find your 5-second rule. And the Three Word Rebellion book is not meant to be consumed, it's meant to be interacted with. And I know how people are about books and how precious they get, especially when you like, we put a lot of love and thought into the design of that book. And I was just like, no, I do. I want you to write. I want you to highlight. I really want you to use this book because otherwise, if you don't use it, you're not going to even get close to the result of the book.
Or the intention, yeah, the intention that you as the
Yeah.
reader purchased it, much less you as the writer created it.
Yes. Yes. So I'm always excited when I see people just using the book and writing in the book and taking pictures of what they wrote or what they highlighted. I'm like, yes.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm so glad. And so, as a result of this book, this first edition, you
Hmm.
recently did the second edition. So, what was that like going from a first edition to a second edition? Like, how did you know? How did you know it was ready for a second edition? And then,
Mm.
how did you know what to put in or change?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I wrote the book initially, like I was still probably with like in a year of using the three word rebellion as a methodology and working with clients. And I always felt that in my heart, I was like, no, it's good, it's solid, it needs to be out in the world doing its thing. But I also knew I needed to add to it, especially as I was working with it more and more. And I just started seeing things that needed to be included in the book. Like, I needed to include an argument for why messaging is important, because that was something that, especially if you're an online business owner, it is the part that people skip all the time. They just think they need marketing. And if their marketing doesn't work, they think it's the strategy. They're like, oh, I should probably be on TikTok. And it's like, or is it what you're saying? And so, really making an argument for why messaging matters and how it's this overlooked piece was an important part of that. I also wanted to include what I call the intrigue loop, which is this test for like if your three word rebellion is any good or not. Because then people would buy the book, slide into my DMs, and be like, hey, this is my three word rebellion. What do you think? And I'm like, I think I get paid for that. like, like, that's what I think. Like, that is a paid service. That's how I make money. Um, but I wanted to give people a way to kind of test it for themselves in their head. And I also wanted to do more case studies and updated case studies and put more information about like the supporting messaging you need, because your three words are great, but then you have to make an argument for why people should buy into those three words, which is more messaging. So it was just like all of these little holes I was seeing. And then I'm like, okay, it's been a couple of years. It's time to fill in these holes and just really what I felt like I was just strengthening the argument for this book and making it better and more useful for the reader. So that was really the point. When I started seeing all the little holes, I'm like, oh, I need to talk more about this. And or, ooh, I really love this case study with a client. I really want to put that in the book. So when you start seeing things like that, you kind of know it's time for an update.
I love that. I love that you chose to update this and create a new edition of the book versus saying, here's a follow-on book to amplify the message kind of thing, like create a series, so to speak. So I
Yeah. And I didn't feel like I needed a series because I was like, I knew the three word rebellion is such a powerful concept. And it's the thing that I want to be talking about and marketing on and be known for and all of those things. And so for me, it was just like, no, it needs just to be updated. It doesn't need a follow up book.
absolutely, I love that. I love that so much. So writers a lot of times are in the mindset of, okay, so I've written this book and they get it published and they might even be excited about sharing it or not. That might be a comfort
Hmm.
level that they're working through. But another piece that they are embarking upon and then really embracing is the fact that they're running a business. And just like you said, as an online business owner, you are looking at all the writing that you're doing, therefore the messaging that you're doing. But this writer needs to do that too. Would you
Yes.
offer some perspective about that?
Yeah, once you publish the book, that is really the start of the marathon of writing. Because now it's like, great, the book is up on Amazon or it's in bookstores, and that's very exciting. And maybe you've planned a launch and that goes really well. But then after the initial buzz wears off, it becomes like, okay, so how do I market this on an ongoing basis? And if you're a business owner, you're thinking about how do I integrate this book into my sales ecosystem. Like for me,
Mhm.
my book is great for lead generation because people read the book, they get to chapter 5 and they think, oh, I don't want to do this analysis. Like this writing has been fun and amazing and cathartic. And then they're like, oh, wow, it just got super hard. So I'm just going to hire her to do this and help me create this three word rebellion. So it really has this business purpose. And so for me, it's like, well, it's a great lead generation. It's a great way to teach people my language around messaging. And so it's always about marketing the book. And so, like even this year, I'm doubling down on the book. My new opt in is going to be a chapter of the book that people can get to read and figure out like, oh, okay, yeah, this is right for me. This is like what I want to do. So it's like, how can you keep integrating it, we keep mentioning it. It is always bananas to me when someone that I know is like, "Oh, I didn't know you have a new book out," and I'm like, "Really? I feel like I'm talking about this every single day." Or the people who are like, "Oh, I've been following you forever and I just got your book." And I'm like, "Oh yeah, you've been in my email community for 5 years and you just bought the book?" Like, what? So, I mean, and that just kind of shows like we always have to be marketing the book. But along with that as well is that we really, before we get to the point where we're marketing, is we really have to understand the positioning and the message for that book. And before you were talking about, before we started recording, you were talking about how the book is always like, here's my message, here's my compelling argument. And oh, by the way, the book talks about this. So it's kind of this integration, right? And so we have to lead with the message of our book and understand why it's valuable to the reader, or what transformation or what can they expect. And you have to do this even if you're a fiction writer, because it's like, who is this for? Who is going to really enjoy this book? How can you make them curious about reading it so that they pick up a copy or download it on their Kindle or even download a sample on their Kindle to see if they like the book? So we have to be really clear on that messaging and that positioning so that we can always keep marketing the book because that is the goal.
I love how you put that, but you're right. It is a marathon. It is something that you're stepping into, and you got to pace yourself. If you think that it's going to be something that you can just breeze through and it's going to be done very quickly and very easily, there might be some easy spots, but there are also going to be some spots that it feels like, okay, what can I do to freshen this up? What can I do to bring some more life or some more joy to it so that it feels that way to the recipient? Because they can, a reader, your target audience, they can feel when you're excited about it, they'll be more
Mhm.
excited about it. If you're not excited about it, how are they supposed to be excited about it?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, and it was interesting. I was chatting with a client of mine who wrote a book around her three-word rebellion. And she said to me, she was just like, oh, when I stop talking about the book, sales decrease. I'm like, yeah, isn't that funny how that works? Like, if you're not talking about the book, you're not going to be making sales and it's just going to die in the basement of Amazon.
Exactly, exactly. So, to your point about positioning and message,
Hmm.
that it being necessary for both fiction and nonfiction, would you offer a your perspective and guidance on the difference between message and position, just in case somebody's not sure?
Yeah, positioning is how your book is unique from all the other books on the market or all the other books in your genre. So like if you're a historical fiction writer, like what is your unique take? Like where does this book fit in and how and what would make people compelled to read it? And then the messaging kind of springs from there of like, how do you talk about this book? Make a compelling argument. So, positioning can be very finite and concrete. Like, I know exactly how this book is different. Whereas the messaging is all of the things you need to say in order to get people interested and give them that compelling reason to pick up your book and want to read it.
Very cool. Very, very cool. Thank you for describing that. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So, as a writer, do you like to read a lot?
Oh, I read all the time. All the time. I'm always reading.
Now, do you prefer fiction over nonfiction, or do you read a little bit of both? And how does that affect what shows up with your writing?
Yeah, I read both. I definitely go through phases. Like I'll go through a phase where I'm like in a nonfiction bend. Like over the holidays, I read a lot of fiction, and that's kind of continuing into the year because I just feel like nonfiction you read for learning, and fiction I really read for enjoyment and the storytelling. Although I have to be very careful and not stay up till like 3 o'clock in the morning reading a fiction book because sometimes you just can't put it down. You got to figure out how it ends, which is a problem. But what I love about both is that there's always something in a book that I'm reading that relates to a client or to a friend or being able to make a recommendation. There's been so many times where I'm reading a book and then a client brings something up and I was like, oh, have you read this book? Because I think, they are talking exactly about what you're talking about. This could be great support for you. Or even like yesterday, I was talking to my podcast producer, and he was talking about how he loves libraries, and I was like, "Oh, have you read The Personal Librarian?" I'm all like, it's historical fiction about this black woman who passed as white who built a huge library for one of the I forget what his name is. Oh, JP Morgan. And it's like it's a true story, but a lot of it has been fictionalized. And he's like, oh my god, that sounds awesome and right up my alley. So it's so nice to be able to have those recommendations and just kind of like how books help me like work with my clients.
But yeah, it is kind of neat when when it almost feels like you like that book too. Oh, we have this connection now because there's something common that you both understand about that, or there's some interest there. Even if you have a different perspective on that same title,
Yeah.
it's still a form of community that it's created.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
So you mentioned that, and for the podcast, that you do host a podcast.
Yes.
And I know you write social media and emails as you need, and you also write books. So, how do you delineate when you have content that really is more appropriate to be a podcast or blog element versus there's more here and I want to savor this as a book? Or how do you think through some of those pieces in case somebody is contemplating
Mm.
how to think through a nonfiction book?
Yeah, for me, a book is always about making that bigger argument, whereas the like a podcast episode or a blog post has a finite transformation you want to give to people. So like when I do a podcast script, I always ask myself, okay, so what's the business purpose of this, right? So it's like, okay, I want to book consults for the 3 Word Rebellion messaging intensive. And then the second question I ask is like, well, what do I want my audience to get out of this? And it's like, for the podcast script I'm working on for today, it's like, oh, I want people to realize that if they want to break away from manipulative marketing tactics that are so often taught, that they have to start building an argument for their work and what that looks like. So I get very clear, and that's like a very finite piece of content. Although I feel like building an argument for your work could be an entire book, probably with multiple pieces. But for now, that's like could be just like the bite-sized thing I want to talk about. And then the book is really like, because even with the 3 Word Rebellion, as I started talking about it more and more before it was a book, I would do podcast episodes, and then I get those transcripts and put it in my book folder so I could start piecing things together. So really the book is always this larger body of work where you need more time and space to actually explain something thoroughly versus, just a podcast episode.
But it doesn't mean that the podcast episode or that conversation over here or all the pieces that you've had, they're basically like little divine breadcrumbs or little nuggets that all are feeding in, and they're pieces that can show up in the book. It's just that, to your point, the book, it offers more. It offers
Yeah.
more of a solution, more of a conversation, more of the argument, as you said, to
Mm-hmm.
than one piece of the whole pie.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Very, very cool. So when you think about structuring a book, especially like so the 3 Word Rebellion and the- structuring a nonfiction book, I tend to think of those as some form of transformation. That reader has
Mm-hmm.
picked up this book for they're trying to solve a problem. And by the end of the book, some kind of transformation solution should be felt. Even if
Yes.
it could be a mindset shift, it could be actual things they're starting to put in place. So how did you architect or think through the structure of the 3 Word Rebellion?
Yeah, it was interesting because once I came up with the idea, like I had a download for like, it was just like, I don't know, like I was like, I think I outlined what the chapters of the book should be like in a few minutes. But then as I started writing, I was thinking about because each chapter you're making essentially an argument, you want to have some type of transformation in it. And then it was like, I remember I was going back and forth. I was like, does embodying the rebel leader need to be before like why we should create a movement and why messaging is important? Like, what is the best order for that? Because some of it was clear. It was like, okay, so the intro chapter is just going to be the introduction to the book and why I think communication is so important and what to expect. And then chapter 1, I'm like, okay, I need to talk about what a 3 Word Rebellion is to get people to buy in. And then I'm like, all right, 3 Word Rebellions require you to lead, but they're also asking you to build a movement. And I just like, I don't know how to structure, like, what's the best organization? So I actually asked my beta readers, I was like, what do you think? Because it could have gone either way. Um, but yeah, for me, I was really lucky that the book structure was really clear. But what was interesting when I was doing the rewrite, I realized the last chapter of the book actually needed to be 2 chapters. Because in the original, I was talking about how do you launch your rebellion, but then I had to also talk about supporting messages. And I was like, oh, that chapter about the messages to support your rebellion needs to be pulled out because they need that before they can actually launch. So it's just interesting, like as you start working with it, you start having these questions, even though if you get this like great download of like, okay, here's the outline, here's what I want to cover. Yeah, then all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, am I making the best argument here? Does this make the most sense? If I'm the reader, and sometimes we're way too close to make some of those decisions.
But I love that you mentioned that you worked with beta readers. How did you identify who they were? How did you select them?
Yeah, so I picked my friends and colleagues who I thought just had a great point of view. And I wanted people with a different point of view. So, like, one of my beta readers was a marketing person, one was a comms professional, one did sales and was a male, which was delightful because I wanted to have that kind of male perspective as well. That's so I just reached out and they were willing and so grateful.
But I love the fact that you also mentioned that it was diverse, that you looked for different perspectives in order to strengthen the book as a whole, because having the different perspectives also gives you a chance to sift through and say, is this reaching who I'm intending it for? But also, are there pieces that I'm missing or should be expounding upon because of the feedback? So how did you delineate between the feedback you were getting as, yeah, I need to do something with it, versus, no, I think I'm going to stick to what I have, but thank you for telling me.
Yeah, there's definitely times like that because I'm like what I always tell people with feedback, it's like you don't actually have to do everything they tell you.
Right.
Because there were times where I would get a piece of feedback and was like, I can see your point, but I feel like it's going to down a rabbit trail I don't want to go. And also, when I was having somebody copy edit the book, they'd be like, if you say this, you need to explain it more. And I'd be like, great, I'm not saying it anymore. Let's just delete it. Because I was like, oh, yeah, you're right. But I can make the choice not to go down this rabbit trail and just be like, let's just delete that line if it's going to take me somewhere that I don't want to like spend a ton of time talking about. So yeah, I would just, like, yeah, there was feedback that I was like, yeah, that's a really good point. And I don't think I'm going to go there.
But I think that the thing that I'm taking away is that you were clear about the vision that you had
Mm-hmm.
and that you were honoring your voice for it, because it does take a village to bring a book together. To your point, you had betas, a copy editor, there are other people who were instrumental in helping a book come to life. But in the
Yes.
same breath, it's still the author's story and the author's voice. And I'm a big believer that if the story was given to you, whether it's the story or the message, whatever that is, if it's given to you, then you're the right person to tell it. And so honor that.
Yes, that discernment I think is so important. And I recently for my podcast had the co-creator of the TV show Chopped on, and he was talking about like how they pitched it and got it to network and really brought this idea to life. And he was saying um they got so much feedback that they actually almost tanked and never got it on the air because they shot a pilot that was terrible because everybody's like, oh, you should do this and you should do this and you should do that, and they watered down that initial concept. And it was because they, writers weren't using their one sentence pitch for the show as that guiding light, and it was just like, sure, we can put that in, and sure, we can do this, and sure, we can do that, and try it, and da da da. And then it was like the show was a hot mess. So they had to reshoot the pilot in order to get it produced. And I think that can happen, especially because we're just like, oh, I would just love your feedback. And then we think we get it and we have to implement all of it. And it's like, oh, no, you do not. Like, you can just say, I like the point you're making. I don't think it's right for the direction of this book. So yeah, like that's too many cooks in the kitchen. At the end of the day, you're the author with the vision for the book. And so you can take what you need and leave the rest behind.
I love that. Michelle, this has been awesome. Thank you so, so much. Where can people connect with you? Where can they get the books?
Yes. So you can connect with me. My website's drmichellemazur.com. If you want a free sample of the Three Word Rebellion, you go to threewordrebellion.com. I am also on Instagram, Dr. Michelle Mazur. So feel free, slide in my DMs. Let me know what you took away from the show. And the book is available on Amazon primarily, and we're working to get it on other outlets. It's been a journey with Ingram Spark, and I'm switching companies right now. So hopefully we'll get it like on Book Depository and Barnes and Noble and bookshop.org soon.
Very cool. I hope that happens for you too very soon. Thank you so, so much, Michelle. I am so glad you were on the show.
Thank you for having me. This is fantastic.